bag puppets this way and sideways in the front.
Stick puppets.
Stick puppets. Yeah. So something's on a stick like this.
Sock puppets.
Sock puppets. Absolutely. Lots of nods. Indeed, similar to its more ephemeral cousin, the paper bag puppet. Yes.
How about Topo Gijo? Remember? You're just way too young. Ed Sullivan, Topo Gijo.
Oh,
Maybe
these
you're
ones.
gonna-
This one.
Yeah, hand puppets.
It's a hand puppet, but it's
It's a
different.
hand puppet.
It's just a hand. And when we talked about the Muppets, a lot of the Muppets are
These are called, Muppets are called hand and rod puppets. So your hand is in it, talking usually, and then usually you have a rod that your other hand is holding, and so that might be their arm. So hand and rod is what those are called. The hand puppets you guys were talking about, like a sock puppet would be considered a hand puppet. The puppets like Mr. Rogers style, where they have the two little arms, they have a little head, those are called glove puppets, because it's like you're wearing a glove. Shadow puppets are huge, and within shadow puppetry, there's bajillion styles as well. That's one of my faves too, is shadow puppetry. Rod puppets, somebody mentioned the sticks. Yes, we call those rod puppets. We have one of those here who I'll show you in just a little bit. And there's one kind of big one that we haven't touched on yet, which is a lot of, do you know? Tell me.
Puppets?
Which one?
Finger puppets?
Finger puppets, yes, that's perfect. That's not what I was gonna say, but I love that. Absolutely, finger puppets are totally a form of puppetry. And there's actually, you've just reminded me that there's two we haven't touched. One that is in this play a lot is something called contact puppetry. So you might have heard of something called bunraku, which is a form of ancient Japanese puppetry. And bunraku involves usually more than one puppeteer bringing one creature to life. And so this contact puppetry is the same idea where you're physically touching the puppet, which I'll show you here in a little bit. So you're making contact with something in order to bring it to life, which is my favorite form of puppetry. And the other one we do have a lot in the show, and if you haven't seen it yet, keep your eyes out, is we have a lot of object puppetry, which can also be kind of object theater. And so you'll see that some of the objects in this show are not treated like props, they're actually treated like puppets. So the lamplighter planet, when you see the show, that's a really good example of something being an object puppet. Yeah.
What about puppeteers on stage versus hidden?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what to call that exactly.
So
Yeah.
usually when you see puppeteers on stage, which is how we do Little Prince, we call that white light puppetry because you're seeing them in the light. Versus where they're hidden on stage, we usually call that black light puppetry or Czech black because it's based in Czechoslovakia originally, where either there's light and the puppeteer is kind of in the darkness so you can't see them, or it's an actual UV black light.
What about Warhorse?
Warhorse is white light puppetry.
Okay.
Yep,
Because
you can see them.
them.
Exactly.
Or-
But let me
Except
ask you this.
You don't see them after about
I was just
5
gonna
minutes.
say,
they're
they
gone.
disappear, right?
Are folks familiar with Warhorse? Will we say, oh, okay, great.
I'll talk for way too long.
Katie will talk a little bit about, but would you say maybe just a little bit about Warhorse and maybe
Yeah.
what Warhorse has meant to the puppetry community in terms of
Yeah.
reinventing how maybe the general public or people who are not deeply immersed in puppetry might think about why bring puppets into a production?
Absolutely. Warhorse is a fantastic example of this. So for those of you who don't know, Warhorse is a story that's about a horse in World War I, and it's about his sort of journey to find his person, right, his owner. But it's about a horse, so like, how are we gonna do that on stage? It's a horse. The answer is puppetry. And so what is so beautiful about Warhorse is it is a contact puppet. There's some rod puppets as well, or rods in it. But it gives you the essence of this character. His name is Joey. It gives you every emotional indicator that you want on a horse. You know, his ears move, his tail moves. He doesn't speak. There's no language or anything. He's meant to be hyper-realistic. And to the point of what that has done for theater.
Because Warhorse began at the National Theatre in London
Right.
in international collaboration with a puppet company called
Handspring.
Handspring out of South Africa.
Yep.
So it's puppetry. Not only is it puppetry on a very large scale because it's several full-scale horses. It's also puppetry on a sort of international collaborative scale and at one of the sort of world's preeminent theater companies, the National Theatre in London.
And showing what's possible, right? Like, you can do a play that has a horse on stage. You can do a play that has a 16-foot snake. You can do a play that has a fox. And so puppetry opens this up. And there's, in the industry, we are feeling this shift in pop culture a little bit, where the world is starting to go back to practical effects, specifically talking about movies and TV. Baby Yoda is the perfect example of this. We all lost our minds with Baby Yoda. The reason why is because he's not CGI, he's an actual puppet. And so we're starting, I know, right? So we're starting to see this resurgence of practical effects, which is very exciting for our world, and even more on stage.
And I feel like that's probably where the neuroscience comes in a way, right? Katie, when you talked about your undergraduate degree, that like, there's lots there, and maybe we'll get into at the end about our ability to connect to objects and to feel connection that goes sort of beyond a person-to-person connection and goes beyond what we can achieve also in film landscapes with those CGI, totally manipulated landscape.
Yeah.
Joan, I saw you had, did you?
Yeah, I have a question. Which came first? Warhorse is fairly new, right? It's a stage presentation.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of Lion King and then going back to business, the world of that business play where they had full-size puppets and they were walking behind the puppet.
That sounds cool.
Theatreworks didn't do that movie then, but.
I gotta see this.
Yeah.
This play.
Oh,
Yeah.
Stop the world, I wanna get off.
Oh, sure. Sounds great. So are you asking kind of which one came first in that? Lion King for sure, of those three, I guess I'm not as familiar with the business play, but Lion King, gosh, when did Lion King happen? Early 2000s?
Late 1990s?
1990s? Yeah. And that was one of the biggest uses of puppetry on stage with Julie Taymor.
Incredible.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about Lion King in a way, I mean, those puppets are incredible, and at the same time, often the way that they're manipulated is different than Warhorse. They have a sort of, they sort of exist as almost scenic objects.
They use the
in
human
some way.
form, too.
They use the human
Yeah.
form is often very acknowledged, but they exist almost as objects or external pieces. I'm thinking of, if you've seen The Lion King on stage, there are those enormous lion masks that exist above the heads of the performers, so we're sort of seeing the mask and the performer's face at the same time. But there's not as much interaction sometimes between the performer and the object as there is with Warhorse when the puppeteers are physically inside the Joey puppet, the actors are interacting with the puppet entirely and sort of not ignoring, but
Oh yeah, ignoring.
okay,
That's
ignoring
right, yeah.
the human bodies inside.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
And that's what you'll see in Little Prince is a lot of that type of puppetry, where the puppeteers come on, you see them for maybe 30 seconds, and then they kind of disappear, which is super beautiful.
Yeah.
And that's how you know we have good puppeteers, which we do. All the puppeteers in the show are absolutely phenomenal, like truly have blown me away, and because they're disappearing on stage, and that's part of how you can tell.
While being acknowledged in the light.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I think the idea that puppetry has been around and it has had these glimmers, these moments is absolutely true. And the director of Lion King, Julie Taymor, has been using puppetry throughout her work. She studied, we mentioned shadow puppetry before, which is an enormous traditional art form in Indonesia. And the director, Julie Taymor, who directed Lion King, and then the very ill-fated Spider-Man Turn Off the Lights, which if you follow Broadway News was an enormous and very expensive public flop about 12 years ago. But she spent quite a bit of time in Indonesia just studying traditional puppetry arts there and borrowing from those traditional and higher art traditions as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
amazing.
So like all of that is going into the puppetry, soup a little bit.
I think
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
So Katie, before we bring these ideas of aesthetics and how we manipulate and how we construct puppets, can we?
Yes.
Can we do it?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Can I speak to it a little bit?
Oh my
about how
gosh,
you get
of
those out?
course.
Okay.
Yes, can I hand them out?
Yes.
Okay,
For
I'll
brave
be your-
volunteers.
Oh man, I'm waiting.
So, when I
We're gonna
teach
have to
puppetry, which is also, this is exactly what I did with the cast on the very first day of Little Prince rehearsal. And it's actually what we did in callbacks. In puppetry, there are 3 fundamental things that you need to bring a puppet to life. The first one is breath. So everything in our world breathes in some way. Even plants breathe in their own way, right? And so figuring out how to bring breath into something, always number 1. Because if it's breathing on stage, it's alive, right? There you go, you got one easy one. So breath. The next one is focus. And what that means is it's what the puppet is looking at. So what are they focusing on, right? And so If the puppet has eyes, great, there's eyes, you know clearly where they're supposed to look. If they don't have eyes, like our rose puppet and our desert flower, they don't have any eyes, so you still have to figure out how is it looking at something. Those of you who are familiar with Little Shop of Horrors might be familiar with Audrey too, same idea. You know where Audrey's looking even though she doesn't technically have eyes, right? So breath is number 1. Focus, number 2. The third one is called weight. This is the hardest one. So when you have a puppet, hopefully your puppet designer has built it in a way that it's very lightweight because it's really hard to manipulate things that are super heavy. However, the trick to that is because it's lightweight, you have to trick us into believing that it's heavy and that believing it has muscle and sinew and flesh and tissue and all these things, right? So like the fox puppet, or the snake puppet's actually an even better example. She's extraordinarily lightweight, but it's up to the puppeteers to make us feel like she has this weight behind her, right? So breath, focus, and weight, those are the 3 that we have. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, are you guys ready to play a little game? Those of you with scarves.
I'll play
So Caitlin's gonna play with us. Ooh, I like that scarf. Okay.
Oh, I know.
So here's the very first thing. You're going to create breath with your puppet. So, excuse me while I figure out my hands.
Shake them out. Shake them out. Shake out your little guy.
So all that I want you to do is take just a sec to find what you want the head of your puppet to be. It can literally be like this. It can literally just be you have a little piece smooshed up like that. If you want to be more creative, that's also totally cool. So you got your little head, right? Now what I want you to do is worry on breath. Don't worry about anything else except you're just going to start to add a little bit of breath into your puppet. And all that I'm doing with my hand is I'm slowly lifting it up and down, giving it breath. I could also maybe have a hand inside or under something and giving breath that way as well. Sorry, it's falling off my lap.
Do you want a less slinky
I
one?
do want a less slinky
Take a
one.
less slinky one.
Thank you. Oh, brilliant.
I'll take a slinky one.
So you can add breath, and it can just be as simple, right? It's just a little bit of hand movement. Maybe it's going up and down. Yeah. Nice. Amazing. So that's step 1. Now, of course, depending on what your puppet's doing on stage, they might be really out of breath if they just ran and had a big crazy scene. Maybe they're feeling a little sleepy, so they're breathing a little softer, right? That's all part of how you bring something to life with puppets. So then let's look at the second one. This is focus. So wherever you've created your little head on your little friend, this is hard to do with one hand. Okay, so then you're gonna have your little friend and just have it start to look around. So you're gonna just play with the idea that it has focus. So it's very clearly looking at Caitlin, it's very clearly looking over here, it's looking at section A, right? And so you're just playing with the idea that the puppet looks around. It seems so simple, easy, right? But if you forget to do this on stage, we can tell. So this is one of those things that you really build in, right? So that's focus. And then there's weight. I am going to need 2 hands for this, so I'm gonna explain it and then I'm gonna show you. So with weight, like I said, this is just a piece of fabric, and so when it falls, I want it to feel like it has that weight behind it, right, of whatever the creature is. So I'll show you really quick.
I don't at all.
So the difference between, let's say this guy was gonna jump, right, and maybe he's looking around, he's breathing, he's getting ready, and he jumps. We don't really believe that, right? Okay, let's see what happens if we add a little bit of weight behind it. So now this time, he's got some breath. We merely maybe see him think about it. He's really thinking, he's getting ready, and he jumps, and he, do you see the difference on that? So it's that idea that like, you're bringing in that weight, you're bringing in that breath. It's not just a thing that we're flying around, right? So if you want to try on your lap, you can. So, you know, you can kind of feel the difference between like, oh, I'm just moving the scarf versus what does it feel like if this creature really has to think about it? Maybe takes a breath, it jumps up, and it actually has to land, right? So that's how we show weight, which you'll see in this show if you come to the Little Prince this afternoon or whenever you come, you'll kind of see how we've incorporated some of that.
So the 3 things we're thinking about as we play with our little puppet guys for a sec are,
Breath.
what are they breath and
Focus.
focus, weight, awesome.
A+, good job.
Take a sec to play with your little guy.
Yeah, so you can play with the idea of what does making it heavier feel like? What does making it breathe faster feel like? How does that start to kind of create a character? You might find yourself very attached to these scarves after the end of 3 minutes. When I do this with kiddos, sometimes we use plastic grocery bags, and I let them, tie knots in it, whatever they want. And at the end, they're always like, Miss Katie, can can I keep it? I'm like, yes, you can keep the plastic bag. You get this kind of fun attachment. There's also this thing that happens with puppetry that happened a lot in our show, where the more you practice and the more that you work with your specific puppet, you guys there's kind of this synergy that starts to happen. To the point, and this has happened to me many times, especially on stage, where I'm not really sure if I'm leading the show or if the puppet's leading the show, but whatever we're doing it together, right? And so sometimes you feel that a little bit in these exercises too, when they really start to come to life. Look at you guys, you're all puppeteers. I love this. You could be in the show. This is great.
So Katy, in a process, I've got two microphones, it's just me now. I'll give it back to you when you're answering this question, as I can come and collect your guys. So take a second to say goodbye to your little guy. So Katy, in a process like this one, where you started working, we'll talk a little bit about your design and construction process in a second, but in terms of the room with the actors, you were working with, of the 3 actors who puppet in this play, you were working with 2 of the 3 actors had never puppeted before, Colton and Kaylee?
I think Colton had put a puppet on his hand before.
I mean, he's
but I
a
think
dad,
that's,
so.
yeah, he's a dad, yeah, exactly. He's
so
dad level.
He's dad puppet.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, Kaylee had not done it before.
So you're working with new folks. You are starting actually with the same scarf exercise, and then you also had not only the puppeteers, the folks who will puppet in the play do the scarf exercise, but actually the full cast join you. And will you talk a little bit about why it was beneficial for the full cast, not only the folks who puppeted, to explore this, and what those other actors add to it, and then also maybe, any other steps for working with brand new puppeteers and getting them into it?
Yes. Good, hands up. Okay. So there's 5 folks who are in this show. As Caitlin said, 3 of them are puppeteers. One of them is, she's only a puppeteer, so she is the puppet captain, and she's kind of helping with everything else. Thanks, Skylar. It is so important to also teach the actors who are on stage with the puppets what puppetry is, because they are helping us sell it as much as the puppeteers are, right? If the little prince went up to the fox and didn't believe it was real, you wouldn't believe it was real, right? And so it's this beautiful way to have folks it just helps tell the story, right? And it helps the audience believe us more. Thank you guys.
We're gonna have to.
It's all good. So that's what the process is like for working with the actors. And multiple times during Little Prince rehearsals, I would have to give notes to those actors because what they were doing was just so phenomenal, and they were really helping the puppeteers tell the story. And that's also something that can be tricky with working with folks who have not puppeteered before, who are actors. As an actor, those of you who are in the theater probably know, this is your tool, right? Your body is your tool. Your body is how you tell the stories, your voice, everything that you do on stage. And so for an actor to have to kind of give all of that wonderful, lovely energy to something else can be hard. It can be tricky. And that's how we knew we had such a good cast, because all 3 of those puppeteers were like, cool, no problem. And all of that gorgeous work that they had done in their own bodies was suddenly in another body, which was really beautiful. And they get to be a lot of different kinds of acting in the show, which is neat. They get to puppeteer and get to act. So when working with new folks, it's definitely important that everybody also has the same vocab. So doing that exercise we just did with you, even with the folks who are not puppeteers, I can still say, hey, we're gonna have a big breath here, we're gonna work on the focus, we're gonna whatever, and they also know what we're talking about.
Speaking of focus, one of the things that you talk about a lot is not only the focus of where the puppet is looking, but also the focus of where the artist who's puppeteering is looking. And we'll probably see this a little bit when we pick up the puppets, but will you talk a little bit about your philosophy of where the puppeteer looks when they puppet? Does that change a little bit? What does it add? What stories are told there?
Totally. It's a really good question that not a lot of people think about. So my personal philosophy is I always give my personal focus to the puppet. So because the For me as a puppeteer, it's not about me, it's about the puppet, and so I'm wanting to give that focus, because it's the thing, right? If you're watching me on stage and I'm making eye contact with you, you might also want to make eye contact with me, right, rather than looking at the thing that I'm holding. So for me, it's just another way to kind of guide the audience where I want them to look by also looking there. And to be completely honest, it's easier to look at what you're doing. It's just easier. It just is. But that's not how all shows are. So, for example, in film, when you have a puppet above your head, it's completely different because you're looking down at a monitor, and usually it's in reverse, which is really hard. It's very difficult. And then there's some shows, like Avenue Q is a great example of this, where that show is very specifically staged that the actor and the puppet are together and you're not looking at it. It's called sidecar puppetry when you do it that way, which is very difficult. And I actually had a really hard time with that when we did Avenue Q because I am so used to looking at my puppet. But instead, use a lot of mirror work so you can see what you look like in the mirror and you know that you're following the same head movements and same expressions and all of that kind of stuff. And that's why mirrors are so helpful, especially with sidecar. But this, what you're going to see in The Little Prince, for the most part, the puppeteers are looking at the puppet. However, there are some very specific moments that we discovered where you can use that as a theatrical storytelling device, right? Maybe there's a moment where they stop looking at the puppet and they look at a character. And what does that do, right? How does that help tell the story? So keep your eyes out for that when you watch the show, because we did incorporate a few of those moments, which is kind of fun. Yeah.
All right, should we look at some of the folks that we'll meet or have met in The Little Prince?
Where should we start, Katie? Oh boy, let's start with the simple ones first.
Oh, which ones are the simple ones?
We'll start with the rod puppet.
Okay.
So there's two rod. Yeah, I'm just gonna be really loud.
We're just gonna have to do that at a certain point.
So there's two rod puppets in the show. This is the first one. This is actually one of the first puppets that was created because he's so simple. From Sesame Street, you might remember Slimy. He's totally exactly based on him. So this is just a piece of foam that creates a little caterpillar. And you can look around. He's really, really simple. And all that it is I've got these two rods, and when I squish them together, it makes him inch. And when I push them apart, it makes him move, right? And there's stuff that the puppeteer will do in the show where he balances, and he can do little dances, and all kinds of stuff. So this is a pretty diverse puppet. Even though it is so simple. But yes, this is a rod puppet. This is one piece of foam that has just been hacked away with scissors until it turned into the shape I liked. And then I actually used Sharpie and paint to do his little lines, added a little bit of the fuzz, gave him some eyes, and then stuck those rods in there. So super, super simple. This is our first friend. And if you have questions, I guess, feel free to ask.
Slightly more close up.
Oh, good, yeah, please.
I cannot puppet him, Katie. I can show him.
This is the second rod puppet. Technically, it's a rod puppet. The only reason this is a rod puppet is because there's a rod, which is actually a tube. There's a rod on the inside. This is the desert flower. He's on stage for 20 seconds, maybe? But he loves it. He loves being on stage. So this is a very simple puppet. It doesn't necessarily do anything except for being able to move around, which sometimes people think that puppets have to, like, do something to be a puppet. That's so not true. It's the way that you puppeteer it, right? Now, some puppets, like the fox, have necks in them, which make them just more complicated, but that doesn't mean that this is less of a puppet than he is, right? So this guy, he literally just comes out, he says a little thing, he talks, and he disappears. But this is the rod. He's made out of upholstery foam and craft foam with a lot of paint and feathers just for some of that passive movement that we love to see in puppets.
Katie, is there like a puppetry school where they're like, here are the objects that are really useful, specialized puppetry foam, or do you just become like professional?
You self-learn
scavengers?
everything.
Yeah, really?
That's not true. There's a handful of universities in America. I think there's actually only 2 now that offer puppet programs. Europe is a different story. You can get professionally trained in Europe as a puppeteer. In America, not so much. So everything that I've done has been self-taught, or I've had mentors along the way, or watched a YouTube video, or exactly as Caitlin says, scavenged. You should see my garage. It's full of all kinds of weird stuff I just like find on the street and save for puppets. And it's a lot of just trial and error. What works, what doesn't work, what looks good on stage. Also, for a show like this, it has to have longevity because we use the puppets for 4 weeks. So that is going to be different than a puppet that you make for a little shoot, a little commercial shoot, and it goes away forever, right? Let's look at Rose next. So Rose, she is sort of the next level up of simplicity, or I guess complexity. Rose is basically just a hand puppet. She's extraordinarily simple. This is all that it is. There's literally a PVC handle behind her that you hold, but what makes her come to life is breath, focus, weight, right? So if I'm just like doing this, okay, but if I give her some breath, she's looking around, she's checking out her surroundings, she's watching Caitlin. See, and the difference between that kind of puppetry. So even though she doesn't have a face, she doesn't have eyes, the amount of emotion that Kaylee can get across with this puppet is extraordinary, and you'll see that. And the other sort of piece of this puppet, there's a reason that her head is not attached to this, which you will see in the show, but when she kind of has her big scene, this is the sprout of the rose that initially grows. So this puppet's actually used a lot of different ways. It's used sort of as a rod puppet initially with the sprout, and then the puppeteer is able to put this over her like this. There's a little finger loop in here, so she just takes her little finger, she puts it in here, and now she's attached pretty simply. And then she's able to grab this one, and now it's kind of become one full thing. And now she can gesticulate a little bit more and ask things and be pouty and all the stuff that she does in the show, right?
Will you, and this might be like a little bit of a vulnerable question, but in some ways, like oftentimes when you're working as a puppetry designer director, you are more of a solo artist.
Yeah.
And for this one, like the idea for the rose, she was always going to have puppetry, but originally when she was designed with the costume designer had designed like a green leotard, and the sort of vine parts were going to be more part of a costume. And then over the course of the process, she evolved.
Yeah.
And will you speak to that, like that evolution
Yeah.
quality, and like
Totally.
you know, I bet there are things that are hard about it, there are things that are fun about it, there are things that are like you're seeing things in maybe different ways.
Yeah, she was initially more of a costume. That's one of the best ways to put it. And and talks with the other designers and with Caitlin, we realized that the things that Rose needed to do and how she needed to feel on stage were maybe not going to be as accomplished as successfully through costume design as we originally thought. And so as we talked about it, we realized that she needed to have a little bit more articulation. And my personal process with this, she had many iterations, probably like the 4th or the 5th version of Rose, and it kept being that thing of like, what are we missing? Or there's too much of this, or there's too little of that. And that's something that, for me, is really important with puppetry, because I'm very much a type of person who likes to build with others and likes to discover things together. And so talking to Caitlin and the other designers and talking to the puppeteer, we were able to figure out what this show really wanted to be. It's one of those things, and if any of you are designers, you'll understand this, but you go into a show thinking you know what it's gonna be, and then everything changes. And then it turns into something else, and you kind of have to figure out how to change with that. The other example is the men, if I may talk about that too.
Absolutely.
So originally there's 5 men in the story who
When
are
the
these
little prince
silly-
visits other planets.
Yeah.
In the book there are 6, but the adapters cut out the one where he goes to the planet of the drunkard, because they felt like that was maybe not what we needed to show.
And so those puppets, those characters originally were going to be puppets. And they were going to have an element of puppetry and an element of the actor. So for example, one of them was, the top half of the actor with silly little legs, right? Stuff like that. And so that was the whole concept. And to be totally honest, I always had a really hard time with those puppets. They never felt right to me. I knew that we were
so many iterations.
So many iterations. We were just kind of figuring out what they needed to be. And we had the first day of rehearsal. And the actors did a playthrough, which was really cool. Do you want to talk about what a playthrough is versus a read-through?
So oftentimes a first theatrical rehearsal will begin with what's called a read-through. So after everybody meets everybody else and looks at pictures of what the design is, you sit down at a table and you read the entire text. I have feelings about read-throughs and what they do and do not do, because oftentimes I think they can privilege a very intellectual and very word-based approach to the play, because you're sitting at a table, not using your body, processing just the words with your brain. And as you're going to see, this production of this play is very physical, it's very imaginative. We had already spent a lot of time as a design team building a world, and I wanted the actors, before they saw the world that we had built, to feel that same amount of, I'm gonna use like a sort of grad schooly word, but like embodied understanding of the work in their body. So we did something that I've honestly never done for a play before, which was like, okay, y'all, so we're gonna start at the beginning, and we're gonna end at the end, and we're just gonna be on our feet the whole time. This is the playing space, this is the big blue tape, and we all know when we talk, and we did a little physical exercise to make sure everybody knew what everybody else's physical boundaries were, and then we just did the whole play on the first day of rehearsal, never having rehearsed it before. And there were just some really beautiful staging moments from there that have stayed in the final production. There were some amazing, strong choices from all of the performers. Like they knew that all three of them were the snake somehow, and they had to figure out what it meant for all three of them to be the snake without ever talking about it on the first day of having met each other. And it was a really wonderful experience, and we learned so much.
Kind of blew our minds. I was
Yeah.
sitting there with the designers, and we were like, the show, what is the, oh my God, like it was so cool. And I had never seen a playthrough before, so that was a really cool way that Caitlin introduced us to that. But in the playthrough, what we discovered is that the actors who were playing the men were so phenomenal that the puppets weren't going to add to it. The puppets weren't necessarily going to enhance their performances. And I could just see that from day one. And so I looked at the scenic designer and I was like, I think we should cut the puppets. And he's like, I do too. I was like, oh God, I can't believe we're doing this. And so day one, that was a choice that we all kind of made, and I'm very happy
I came back
we did.
out on the break, and Katy and Scott are like, we're cutting the men. And I was like, oh, okay, yes, fine.
And I'm so glad we did, because you'll see when you see the show, what ended up coming from those characters is just wow. And there's still elements of puppetry in them, but there isn't like a fabricated puppet that was limiting the actors.
Right, and you talked about that object work, and then now it
Yes.
allows us to focus in some ways on the planet.
Yes, on the planet, exactly, which is the object of each of the
So watch for
scenes.
that. And then it unites the three big puppets as three special. Who do we wanna?
Let's talk about Snack first.
Are you here for? Yeah. Okay,
So
great.
I will
You're
show you a
getting-
little bit
We're
about.
getting the JV team on the back.
So before we bring her to life, I'll tell you a little bit about what she's made of.
Not you, Skylar.
The head and the rattle are made of something called XPS foam, which is that pink insulation foam, the hard foam, and it's very carvable. It carves like butter. It's amazing. So her head is hand carved, her tail's hand carved. Bree, who's sitting in the audience, helped me cut out the 72 vertebrae that she has on her, which are made of something called EVA foam, which is like a softer closed cell foam rather than upholstery, which is an open cell foam. You'll notice that she has a rope running through her, which is keeping all of her vertebrae together, and she has a belly, which makes sure the vertebrae don't twist on each other so that they stay. This is technically a rod puppet, because we're all holding rods, and we'll show you a little bit how she comes to life. So, the lead puppeteer is the one who starts to drive the train, and the rest of the puppeteers are kind of following behind, creating that snake-like feel, right? And so she can come say hi. And Skylar's on the rattle, which in the show has a noise as well, and so we use that as a way to emotionally indicate how she's feeling.
Ooh, Katy, will you talk about emotional indicators?
Yes, I will, as she slithers around us. So in puppetry, especially in creature puppets, which is what she is, there is something called emotional indicators. And an emotional indicator is something that the puppet designer puts on a puppet to help us understand emotion. So, for her biggest emotional indicator is her tail, because when she rattles her tail, you know she's feeling some type of way. Her other one might be her head, where she's looking with her head, her speed. A really good example of emotional indicator is when a dog wags its tail, we know it's happy, right? So the tail on a dog is an emotional indicator. So for her, those are some specific ones she has. And you can see, obviously we have not rehearsed as much as the puppeteers, because they're way better at it. But there's this,
to show you how hard this actually is.
it's really hard. And you can also see, because she's so long, I can't be like, oh, I'm gonna go, oops, right? I just broke the illusion.
And we spent a lot of time in rehearsal talking about
So I just
realistic snake movement.
You did.
Like, the body and tail of a snake can never go where the head of the snake hasn't been.
Right.
And we would like do that and it would feel very strange. And then there are moments when we break the convention. So as Katie referenced before, watch out for the conventions and the reality to be set, and then when we break them,
Yeah, there's very specific moments that it is broken, exactly. She's going back this way. This is the other thing where it's like, okay, I guess we're going this way, everybody. But yeah, so this is, and another thing that you'll see in the show is the way that the puppeteers use breath. So we'll do an example of this. Here, we'll scooch out a little bit so Skylar can be seen more. Here she goes. So with a puppet like this, breathing like this is not going to be right? That kind of breaks the illusion of what the puppet is. So this is where you get to use the puppeteer's body as well. So the lead puppeteer on the head is giving her breath here, and all that I'm doing is I'm actually moving my knees. And so then these puppeteers, they're watching my body, and they're emulating my breath, and some of that's coming through in the puppetry. And breath is a way that I can silently communicate to my other puppeteers that I'm going to do something. So if I take a big inhale here, they might think I'm going to do something. So I go, right? And now we can be a little bit more in sync. And you'll see that a lot in the show. There we go. Does anybody have any questions about the snake? Sure.
Why is it just the skeleton instead of skin?
Caitlin can talk about that
well,
part.
what does it convey to, so this snake is realistic in some ways, but not realistic as a living snake. What comes to mind seeing the snake in the form that she is? Yes. Or is this a separate question? Okay, hold on. What comes to mind for y'all as audience members or viewers with the snake in the form that she
That
is?
they're not alive.
Pardon?
They're not physically alive.
Not physically alive.
Reminds me of like the toy snakes they used to.
The desert has a
Yeah.
connection to toy snakes. If you remember those like little wooden snakes where you see the exposed vertebrae.
Skull-like.
So,
Does
yeah.
that make you feel anything?
Spooky. Yeah. So these are all things that, so that was an artistic choice.
Yes.
It's a subject of much conversation, to be honest.
Yeah.
But those are all things that we were excited to evoke, actually. So when you see the story of Little Prince, you'll see that we are making a choice about what the snake represents in the story, conveyed through the puppets. Yeah. Over here.
Yeah, two things.
Great.
One, like, could you make the snake, like, curl up?
You can. She can curl up as much until the puppeteer's bodies get in the way. And when you see the show, she kind of almost does that a couple times. Mm-hmm.
But you do have to navigate where the people who are puppeting will go. They got tangled up.
Have you ever tried to add in, like, fangs?
Oof.
Have you tried adding?
I have a different snake puppet who was our doofer, which is my favorite theater word. Doofer means it'll do for now. She's a snake I had built a couple years ago, and she had fangs. She had big, scary fangs. But that you bring up a very excellent point about these puppets. None of the puppets talk. They don't use their mouths, right? They don't open their mouths like this. That was a choice we made.
Like, take a dropper and make, like, a wooden thing.
Ooh.
And instead of taking it, grind it and do it, and then actually look like a dropper.
That would be so cool. If you build that puppet, will you let me know? Because I want to see. Okay, cool. I love it. I love it. But yeah, none of the puppets have articulated mouths, which was great because they're kind of hard. But also, as design choice, we didn't. That's not the style of puppetry that this was. It's not about the lip sync. It's not about this. It's not that Muppet style. It's much more about like sort of the essence of the characters, and you can convey that without having articulated mouths. Yeah. Okay, we'll do this. Baby.
Last and final guy.
I'll show the shadow puppet. I'll do this first.
Okay.
Because he's the best. So you talked about shadow puppetry. There's shadow puppetry in the show. These are some of the shadow puppets. They're very, very, very simple. But Caitlin from day one had this really cool idea that when the aviator does these drawings, which if you're familiar with the book, you'll remember the drawings, we needed to like see that somehow. In the script, they actually suggest using an overhead projector, which we could have certainly done, but we decided to use a different kind of puppetry.
Yeah.
And this is shadow puppetry. This is specifically called front-facing shadow puppetry. So traditional, you have your light source, and then you move in front of it. This is different. You keep your puppet still, and your flashlight is what moves. So our puppeteer, Ellie, is actually able to make it look like it's being drawn. So it's kind of hard to see because it's so light in here. But as I move the flashlight around, you can see that I'm drawing, right? And the closer I get to the puppet, the bigger and the blurrier it is. And I know it's hard to see, but the farther I get away from the puppet, the finer and smaller it is, which we use very specifically specifically in the show. There's also some elements like these stars, which Skylar actually does, which kind of help us do a little bit of world building in addition to being sort of this handcrafted puppet piece. Yeah. And they're just with flashlights. It's so simple. This is my other kind of favorite. This is my favorite style of shadow puppetry. Is this front facing? Okay, I will do a solo first, and then I will have you be my second puppeteer. Thank you. All right, this is the fox. So he took about 30 hours to build. Maybe that's how I feel too, man. I get it, especially with all this fur.
Like 2.5 days.
More than that. It felt like years of my life, but it is more than 24 hours. You're exactly right. So this puppet started as a prototype, which if you go out of the theater and you look at our little dramaturgy board, the prototype of this puppet is actually out there. And so the things that we knew about this puppet is that it had to be a fox. We had talked about sort of the color. We had talked about how faithful to the source material is this one going to be? Is it going to be our own version? Those are kind of things we knew. The other thing we knew is it could be a 1 or a 2 puppeteered puppet, which is very important to know how many puppeteers you have before you start building something, right? So those were the things we knew. What we didn't know is everything else. But basically through rehearsal, what we were able to do is when I created the prototype, it's 1, 2, 3 pieces, and it was flat cardboard with a little handle on it. And I was able to see 1 was the size correct for the 2 puppeteers I had, and 2, what could they do with it and what did they need it to do? So from those discoveries, we realized that it didn't need legs. And you'll see in the show that it doesn't need legs. It doesn't. It might look weird the first time you see it, but after you see it in movement, it doesn't bother you at all. And the main reason for that is because the way that the fox has been staged, it was too complicated to have legs. When things have 4 legs, you suddenly need many more puppeteers, right? Which is a problem when you're building creature puppets, actually. Legs and necks are a rough time. So we knew it could be a legless puppet, which I've seen a design like this before in a dance show, and it was really beautiful and worked really wonderful. The other thing we discovered, both me and Colton were really, really excited about the idea that it had articulated ears. And
Colton is the actor who is the main
Thank you.
puppeteer and the voice of the fox puppet.
Colton Pratt, he's amazing.
Yeah.
And so we needed to build a mech that had articulating ears because the emotional indicators on this are, of course, the tail, the body positioning, but as you know, with animals, especially dogs, ears are huge, right? And so the ability for him to look a little worried, to be happy, to be sniffing, right? All of this kind of stuff. There's so much articulation that can happen. And this is a trigger mech, so I'll kind of come around and show. So basically what this is there's 2 dowel rods on his inner ears, and there's a spring on one side, and there is a pulley on the other. So when I pull this way, I'm creating tension, and when I let go, the spring takes it right back into place, right? So it's actually a very simple mech, but I never built one like this before, so I was a little nervous. But it turned out, it worked out. And the way that Colton is able to do this puppetry is just phenomenal. And I was very excited about this challenge because I had been wanting to build a trigger mech for a long time, and I just didn't have a good enough reason to do it. And this was the perfect opportunity to work on those skills. Yeah, see how it pulls like that? Yeah. And so Fox is able to do all kinds of stuff. So the other cool thing about Fox is he can be a 1 puppeteer puppet, which we do use a few times in the show, or Skylar, you want to be my assist, be the booty. Sometimes there's a 2nd puppeteer, and now Skylar has full control of the tail, which is huge, because that's our other emotional indicator, right? So he can be happy, he can sad, he can sit, he can wrap it around, all kinds of stuff. He can sniff his own tail. And then Skylar's also in control of this part of the body. So this is where weight comes in handy, right? So the puppeteers actually puppeteer him a lot lower to the ground. They make it feel like he actually has weight and he's walking, which is certainly easier done with 2 puppeteers. Now Skylar's job as the secondary puppeteer is to follow my lead, which Colton and Ellie, who's our second, have really figured this out. So if I try to jump up, Skylar's going to be right there with me, right? And the puppeteers in the show, if you look closely, are actually touching their bodies the entire time because they can feel breath with each other. They have this better way to connect, and so that's another technique that we use, which they totally came up with on their own because they're amazing. But yeah, so he's basically made
a
of.
lot for sound. Like I know, like you'll notice when you watch it, like if they're about to do a big move, they will inhale together as a sort of check-in that they're both doing the same thing, which is awesome.
And And that's one thing we talked a lot about in rehearsal, because of course when you're on stage you can't talk to each other like, hey, let's jump down here. So the breath is huge. Obviously it's choreographed so they know the skeleton of what they're doing, but there's certainly a lot of improv that can come. So if we were gonna jump off of this, we might do a breath and a jump, right? And so it's a lot of figuring out how to be connected with each other.
When you watch it, I would say watch, as Katie said, it's choreographed. The show is blocked very precisely. And there is a sequence in which one character is tamed by the other. Taming is the word that they use in the text, you might remember from the book. And that one, especially the final round of taming, is somewhat improvisatory because it has a structure, but the structure is slightly different every night because we wanted it to feel very fresh for the actors. And so there's a lot of nonverbal communication happening between the two puppeteers when you watch Ellie and Colton in that third and final sequence of the taming.
And it's beautiful. It makes me cry every night. I hope you cry. I mean, I don't hope you cry, but yeah. And you know what? How cool is that? That like this inanimate object can make you feel those things, which is beautiful. Yes.
I was thinking like since if it's two puppeteers, it makes 4 legs.
You know, you would think so, but you actually need 3 puppeteers when you have a 4-legged creature. Last year we did a show called Winter Wonders, and in that show there's a fox that has 4 legs. And what happens is one person has to hold the head, one person holds the tail, another person does the hind legs, and another person does the front legs. Now there are creative solutions to that. You're absolutely right. We could figure it out.
You dress only your legs up.
I am
Oh, you
seeing
could
what you're
dress your
seeing from
legs
this
up.
angle where it looks from right here. Like,
Oh, do fox-like legs? Amazing.
well, see what you think. See whether
Yeah.
the puppeteer's legs, when you see it, give that vibe.
And that's very much like the Lion King, where they use the puppeteers' bodies to also be part of the creatures. Sometimes the way that your legs don't work like animal legs. My Pegasus puppet, your front legs are these because horses' legs work the same, but we can't do back legs like that because our legs bend the other way. So being creative on that too. But really quickly, the other materials that are in this guy, this is truly just burlap for his fur, which I chose burlap specifically because I wanted it to have a textured feel. I wanted it to have a little bit of like a velveteen rabbit sort of something's coming to life kind of feel. And also because as the show goes on, it's naturally going to fray, which I want it to do. I want it to kind of have this worn-in feeling. The head is foam, like I said. The internal are wood. These are pieces of Lowans. There's a lot of little tiny things in here. His ears and his nose are made of a material called warbler, which is a thermoplastic, so you can heat it up with a heat gun and then shape it into whatever shape you want. Does anybody have a guess what his eyeballs are? Any guesses?
Googly eyes.
Close, so close. It's something you use in a sport, which I don't play.
Ping pong?
Ping pong, yes. His eyes are ping pong balls. So, and then they're painted with a very high gloss Mod Podge so that they catch the lights under the theater
And
lights.
Katie, I mean,
Yes.
you could have covered the entire puppet in fake fur.
I could
right?
have.
Right? So I think if you were going for verisimilitude,
Yes.
But why not that? For folks who are thinking like, why not
That's a good question.
why not as real as possible? Which is a similar question, right, to why the snake is
Yeah.
bony. Like, what does this fox give that a fox covered in fur would not give?
If you don't do realism perfect, it doesn't look real.
The uncanny valley.
Period. That's why human puppets are so hard to do because we know what humans are, right? We know what it's just hard. Also, he didn't have legs, so having this sort of thing covered in fur might feel like a piece of taxidermy versus a creature. And also because the world of The Little Prince is so color saturated and it's so texture saturated and it's so larger than life, him feeling like an absolute real fox on stage was going to be wrong. Let me rephrase. Him looking like an actual fox would be wrong. He certainly feels like a real fox, though.
And that's the
So-
magic.
and that's
right?
the
That
magic.
He doesn't look like a real fox.
Exactly.
But he feels like
Exactly. And you'll see the way that Sean, who plays the Little Prince, interacts with him and pets him and makes it feel like your puppy dog at home. It's amazing. Yes.
I was just thinking too that with the literary style in the book, because it's kind of imaginative and surrealistic in some places and stuff.
you might wanna have a more ethereal looking fonts
Yeah.
because of that.
Absolutely. That's a really good
Surrealism.
point.
And I would like to make just the point too that like everything that you're gonna see in the whole production and Katie's puppets as well are also entirely the design of Katie and like someone who lives here and makes work here. The book the book has an adaptation, so that has a point of view in addition to the illustrations. But the book, the play tells us very little about how it wants things to be done. Or when it did tell us things, like use an overhead projector, cast an actor as the fox, cast an actor as the rose. We thought that something else better captured the quality of the story. So everything that you're about to see is the choice of an artist who lives here and makes work here, which I think is an exciting element
Yeah,
to what's about to happen.
totally.
All right, y'all. We gotta kick you out because we just gotta get reset for the top of the show. So I'm gonna take a moment to thank you all for coming here, to thank Dr. Kevin Landis, head of theater and dance, as well as the dean's office and the Prologue program in general. Kevin would want me to encourage you to come back in early December when the UCCS theater and dance students from the clown class will be presenting their clown works. Very exciting. And I hope that y'all join us at the Little Prince. Y'all, if you are here for the play, if you could step back. Okay, well, we are ending. Yes. So, so we're gonna, and I'm gonna thank Katie and y'all and ask us to all go out to the lobby for just